Hello students, this is Dr. Lyons, and in this video lecture we're going to talk about how diversity has evolved. And we'll start with this cute little thing here. This is what's known as a tarsier. Believe it or not, that is your great times many greats grandfather. So tarsiers are a very ancient type of primates. We are also primates, and so these are, not, I guess not necessarily our great grandparents, but they are close relatives of ours in the animal world. But unlike us, these things are nocturnal, which is why they have these enormous eyes. Anyway, that's a tarsier. So the things that we're going to be talking about in this particular chapter, and I'll kind of give a preview here now, is we're going to talk about diversity, we'll talk about species, we'll talk about micro and macroevolution. So let's go through some of these questions really briefly. First of all, what is diversity? Right, so diversity, most of us would think of that as varieties of things. Like Los Angeles, for instance, is a very diverse place in terms of humans, right? You have humans that have all different types of ancestries coming from all different types of places, right? So diversity is the variety of things. And in the context of biology, we were talking about the diversity of individuals, like diversity of species. So an area that is very diverse would have a lot of different species. So think of like a coral reef or a tropical rainforest. Those are very diverse places that have lots of species in them. Okay, let's talk about what a species actually is. First of all, this is a question that has befuddled biologists for a long time because it is actually kind of hard to define species. But how most biologists would define species is as a group of individuals that can only reproduce with each other and not with other individuals. So for instance, we are a species and chimpanzees are a different species and sharks are different species and sea stars are different species. How we know that is because you can't have a baby with a chimpanzee or a shark or a sea star. Right, so things that can't reproduce with other things are different species, essentially. Right, so a species is essentially a group of organisms that are all close enough related to each other that they can actually produce offspring with each other. If there's something that an organism can't reproduce with, that means those two things are different species. So how we tell different species apart? Typically, we would do this just by looking at them. Right, so a sea star looks very different from a human, and that's how we tell them apart. But then how might you tell apart two species of sea stars? You know, someone like myself that is a marine biologist might be able to tell two species of sea stars apart, but a lot of people might not be able to. So a lot of times how we have to tell species apart is actually by looking at their DNA. So looking inside of them to see how different they are in their DNA. Okay, what is species diversity? So I kind of mentioned this before when I was talking about diversity. It's essentially the number of species living in an area. So think of like coral reefs, tropical rainforests. Those are the places with the most species diversity. Deserts and the Arctic, places like that have very little species diversity. Not a lot of different species can live there. Finally, what is microevolution and macroevolution? So microevolution is what we talked about in the last chapter. So things like natural selection and genetic drift, right? Those are forms of microevolution. Macroevolution is larger scale processes. So processes that take a very long time and involve really major shifts and major changes. These happen through natural selection and genetic drift. But they're just larger things than, say, the size of the beaks of finches on the Galapagos, changing. That is considered microevolution. Those finches and their beaks changing that we talked about in the last chapter. Macroevolution is going to be larger things like fish evolving, or some fish evolving into amphibians, right? So Tiktaalik and all that stuff. That is more macroevolution. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this chapter is speciation, because this chapter is going to be more focused on macroevolution, because we already discussed microevolution in the previous chapter. And speciation is definitely a form of macroevolution. So speciation essentially is the way that new species get made. And the mechanism for how this occurs is evolution. So speciation has been an incredibly important part of life on this planet because life started with way fewer species than there are today, right? So originally there was maybe just a few species of microbes. And then from those microbes came all of the millions and millions of different species that we have on the planet now. How that occurred is speciation, so new species forming. And how that essentially happens is one species splits in two and becomes two different species. And we can actually see this on an evolutionary tree, right? So here's an evolutionary tree like the one I showed you in the last video lecture. And you see that we have this one branch here, and then that splits and becomes two different branches. This split right here, that is speciation. That is going from where there was one species to where there's now two different species. Right? We have created a new species here because we started with one and ended up with two. And then along here, we've got one species, and then that splits and becomes two species. So here is another instance of speciation on this evolutionary tree. So any place there is a split on a tree, that is speciation. So like I just said, speciation is where there's splits on the tree. So there's kind of two really important parts of speciation occurring. One important part of it is population subdivision. So we take one species and we divide it somehow so that now there's kind of like two different populations. There's population A and population B of this species. And then once a species has been subdivided, then reproductive barriers can form between them. And so now let's talk about what those reproductive barriers are that might evolve through either natural selection or genetic drift. So what you see here is on the right, these are different barriers that essentially keep different species from reproducing with each other. Right, so these are things that prevent, say a sea star and a human from reproducing with each other and having offspring. And so over here I have some descriptions, and so we're going to match these descriptions to the type of reproductive barrier that they are. So let's consider this instance here. So two snakes that live in different areas. That's what's known as habitat isolation, right? So they are isolated from each other by their habitat. So they're not going to reproduce with each other because they're just not in the same area. And we find that with for instance, in the Pacific Northwest, there are garter snakes that live in kind of wet areas, and garter snakes that live in grasslands. And so they live in different areas, so they never see each other, so they can't reproduce with each other. Okay, let's skip number 2 for a minute. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So two sea urchins whose gametes can't fuse, meaning the eggs and the sperm, they just can't match up with each other. This is what's known as gametic isolation, right? So the sperm and the egg, there's a lot that goes on chemically for one sperm cell to recognize one egg cell. And if you have two different species, in general, the egg and the sperm just won't fuse with each other. Okay, two different skunks that mate at different times of the year. This is what's known as a temporal isolation, right? So temporal meaning time, and isolation meaning, being separate. So two skunks, if one, say, reproduces and mates in the spring and one mates in the fall, then there's going to be that barrier that prevents them from mating with each other because the timing is off. Okay, two salamanders that they are able to actually reproduce, so their gametes will fuse, but the offspring that they produce, those hybrids that are a mix of two different species, they're very frail and they die, very, very young. This is what would be known as reduced hybrid viability. Viability means, the ability to exist, like to be viable is to be something that can actually work. And so if the hybrids are not viable, so their viability is reduced, then we say that they have reduced hybrid viability. And so that would describe the situation where two salamanders can have offspring, but those offspring are, really frail and don't survive. Okay, horses and donkeys, they can have hybrids. Maybe some of you know that is what a mule is the hybrid of a horse and a donkey. And mules, in fact, are healthy. And they can live, to a ripe old age, but they are infertile, meaning that mules cannot reproduce. So you can't just take two mules and put them together and have them make a baby mule. It just doesn't work because their mules are sterile. So this is what's known as reduced hybrid fertility, right? So the fertility, meaning how whether they can have offspring of those hybrids, is reduced, and that is the case with mules. It's the case with a lot of other hybrids for that matter. So like ligers, which is a hybrid of a lion and a tiger, same situation with them. They can't reproduce and have more liger babies. Okay, two dragonflies whose genitals, meaning like their naughty bits, cannot fit with each other. So this is what's known as mechanical isolation. And the best way that I can describe this is like a square peg in a round hole, right? So the reproductive bits just do not fit with each other. And that is actually the case with dragonflies. They have actually very intricate genitals, and two species will have, two different intricate, sets of naughty bits, and they just won't fit with each other. Finally, this last one, two species whose mating behavior is different. For instance, fireflies in their blinking patterns. So this would be what's known as behavioral isolation. So if there's some sort of mating ritual in the rituals are different between two different species, that's going to keep them from mating with each other. So I hope some of you watched the video that I posted of the birds of paradise in Papua New Guinea. In the crazy mating rituals that males do in order to attract females. So imagine, for instance, you were to take one of those male birds doing all that crazy dances and stuff, and were to present that bird to a seagull on Santa Monica Pier. Do you think that seagull would reproduce with that bird of paradise? Your answer should be no, because there's absolutely no way that would ever happen. And the reason would be behavioral isolation. So the mating ritual is just not right. Okay, in the last slide, we talked about two plant species that reproduce and have offspring, and the offspring are fertile, but the offspring of those offspring aren't fertile. That's what's known as hybrid breakdown. So specifically with plants, you can sometimes produce hybrids, and the hybrids can produce hybrids, but then the hybrids of the hybrids, they can reproduce. So think of it as like if a mule, for instance, could have a baby mule, then that baby mule wouldn't be able to reproduce anymore. So essentially things break down just a couple of generations forward, as opposed to with the hybrids. So hybrids are viable, hybrids are fertile, but then the offspring of those hybrids, those don't work. So that's what hybrid breakdown refers to. So essentially what happens with speciation is once you have a reproductive barrier, once you have a subdivision, so once a species has been split in two and there's two populations, these different things will evolve either through natural selection or through genetic drift. So let's talk about how that might happen. So there's two ways that this can happen, that speciation can occur, and we'll talk about both. So one is known as allopatric speciation. So that's when there's some actual geographic boundary that has taken a species and split it in two so that it is two different populations. So something has happened like geologically that is split up two species. So that's allopatric speciation. That's in contrast with sympatric speciation, in which there's no geographic separation. It's all occurring in the same geographic area, but still one species splits in two and becomes two different species. So first let's talk about about how allopatric speciation might occur. So this is a sort of semi-hypothetical type example. So let's say we have a species of firefly that is blinking in a forest, I don't know, in say New Hampshire on the east coast of the U.S. where you find these things. So we've got these fireflies and they're blinking away, and that's how fireflies reproduce. So the males blink, and that is an indication to the females that hey, I'm ready to go. I want to have sex and make some baby fireflies. So that's why males are blinking, is to attract the females. So let's say in that forest, let's say there was something happened so that now the forest has been split in two. So let's say, for instance, that I don't know, there was a forest fire in that forest, and now we have two different forests. We have one on the left and one on the right, and now these individuals are separated from each other. Now we have two different populations, right? A population on the left and a population on the right. So over time, when you have these two different populations, they can evolve in separate ways from each other. Right, so consider, for instance, the small fish that I told you about in the last chapter, the three-spined stickleback. Right, we looked at some pictures of different stickleback from different lakes, and in some of those lakes they have really big spines, and other lakes they have different spines, but they're all three-spined stickleback. They're all the same species. So because those fish were in different lakes, they could evolve different ways from each other. And it would be the same with these fireflies. So they're in different forests, they're separated from each other. So now these ones on the right, they can evolve in ways different from the ones on the left. And a way that they might evolve is that the ones on the right might start to blink more slowly, right? So through natural selection over time, maybe the females over on this side, they start to prefer males that have a slower blinking pattern. So let's say that the forest in the middle where the fire was has grown back, and now the two populations are now together again. But now we have some fast blinking individuals and some slow blinking individuals. So a female that is from the fast blinking variety, do you think she is going to reproduce with a male of the slow blinking variety? So the answer is no. She's going to say, no, dude, you're just blinking way too slow for me. That is just not sexy at all. In a female of the slow blinking variety, she's going to look at one of these fast blinking males and say, "Whoa, you're blinking too fast. That's just not cool with me. No, I don't want that." So essentially, now we have two different species because there is this behavioral isolation going on between them. And then over time, we would expect other differences to evolve between them, like their physical appearance might change, and their gametes might change over time, and their genitals might change over time, and all these things are going to change over time and make these two species more and more distinct from each other. So this is a semi-hypothetical type example. Let me give you a bona fide real example of this. So what you see here is how Panama, the country of Panama, so in Central America, how Panama used to look. So if you go back in time 3 million years, there was a waterway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean where the country of Panama is. Of course, many of you now know that there is now a waterway there because a canal was built, connecting the two. But before that canal was built in the early 1900s, there was no way getting across from the Atlantic to the Pacific, unless you were to go back really far in time to 3 million years, in which case there was this open waterway. So 3 million years ago in the past and going further back, there was no connection between the two different sides of Panama. They were separated from each other by water. And an interesting thing has occurred as a result of this. So what you see here are shrimp known as Alpheus shrimp. They are commonly referred to as snapping shrimp or pistol shrimp. And what you see is about 15 different species pairs. So 15 species in the Atlantic and 15 species in the Pacific. So let's talk about how that happened. So if you go back in time, to 3 million years ago and further back, a pistol shrimp could spread throughout this whole area. So essentially, at that time, there was no geographic boundary going on because the Isthmus of Panama had not yet formed. But then what happened is 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama did in fact form. And so now we have this geographic barrier because these shrimp, they can't walk over the land. They're marine animals, so they're stuck on either side. And so then over millions of years, these populations that are now separated from each other, they evolved in different ways and became new species. So for instance, like they changed around in their color and their behaviors changed around and all sorts of other things changed about them. So we have a geographic barrier forms, and then that leads to reproductive barriers that form as a result of that isolation, right? And so now we have different species on north and south, so different species in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. And so this has been a result of allopatric speciation. Okay, let me give you an example of how this might happen on land. So what you see here, probably a lot of you can pick up on the fact that this is the Grand Canyon. In this river is the Colorado River. And so we have these two species of ground squirrels there. And you'll find one on one side of the Colorado River and the other on the other side of the Colorado River. Right? So these used to be one species before the Colorado River, had the audacity to cut a big hole in the ground and separate these two from each other. Right now, this species isn't going to climb down these cliffs and swim across the river and back up just so it can be with its old friend. They're separated from each other. So again, this is allopatric speciation because an actual geographic barrier has formed. In this case, it's the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. In the previous example that I gave, it was the Isthmus of Panama was the geographic barrier that caused allopatric speciation to occur. Okay, let's talk a little bit about sympatric speciation now. So we already talked about allopatric speciation, so that is when speciation results from some sort of geographic barrier forming. Sympatric speciation occurs even with no barrier forming. And so a really great example of these, probably the quintessential example of these, comes with these fish here. And the sort of mutations that they have gotten that have caused major behavior changes in these fish. So these fish are known as African lake cichlids. And you find them in the large lakes in eastern Africa that surround Tanzania. So we have Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, and Lake Malawi that all border the country of Tanzania. And so these fish live inside of these lakes. And these fish have gone through huge amounts of speciation over the past 200,000 years. And that speciation has been sympatric because it's been within a geographic area, within one lake. So the fish that you find in Lake Victoria, that one that's on the border of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, there's over 500 species of those fish in Lake Victoria. There's something like 1,000 of them in Lake Malawi, and somewhere in between in Lake Tanganyika. So there's a lot of these African lake cichlids. So let's talk about what happened here. So in Lake Victoria, for instance, there's 500 species of these cichlids. And all of those cichlids share a common ancestor that goes back somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago in the past. So we talked about common ancestors in the context of phylogenetic trees, of evolutionary trees, right? So the common ancestor, that is that original species that then gave rise to all of the other species that came after that. It's like the great grandparent of all the things that are in all the species that are related to each other in that group. And in the case of the Lake Victoria cichlids, so all 500 of them, they share a common ancestor that goes back 200,000 years at the most. And so to all of us, 200,000 years sounds like a heck of a long time. But in terms of evolution and like geology, it's actually a really short time. So this has been a very, very rapid set of sympatric speciations going on. This is really something that's when scientists figured out, how quickly this occurred, it was really quite startling to them. Okay, so let's talk about how sympatric speciation might occur with these fish in these lakes. So let's say you've got your little African lake cichlids, and you've got this one species that likes to eat stuff off the bottom. Say it likes to eat crabs that are on the seafloor or other types of crustaceans on the seafloor. But let's say all of a sudden one of those fish gets a mutation. And that fish now is saying, you know what, there's some really tasty critters up on the surface of the water, and I think I want to eat those things. So what we essentially end up with is a mutation has caused some fish to be behaving in such a way that they're hanging out just at the surface of the water and eating stuff up there. Meanwhile, the fish that don't have that mutation, they're just hanging out down there on the sea floor, or the lake floor, I should say, eating bugs down there. So do you think the ones that are up here hanging out on the top, do you think they're going to hang out with these bottom feeders and reproduce with each other, with them? The answer is no, right? So these ones up here, they have this behavior that makes them kind of isolated from these other ones that are down here at the bottom. And so what we would expect over time is that, those ones on the top, they might change around a little bit. Maybe they get a lighter color so that they will blend in better, and so airborne predators won't come along and eat them, right? And so now you have essentially two different species, right? So the key thing here is that we're talking about one geographic area, right? So this is all within one lake, but we have a behavioral change that is caused by mutation that causes individuals to behave very differently from the other ones. In that behavioral difference causes them to not reproduce with each other. And then when they stop reproducing with each other, natural selection or drift can cause other sort of reproductive barriers to form. Things like coloration and gametes and mating rituals and things like that will evolve so that now this guy up on the top is not going to reproduce with this, female down here on the bottom. Okay, another way that sympatric speciation can occur is through what's known as polyploidy. So some of you might be remembering we learned about haploids and diploids way back a while ago in the mitosis chapter. And so that refers to the number of sets of chromosomes that an organism has. So all of you are diploid, right? You all have a set of chromosomes from your mom and a set of chromosomes from your dad. The eggs and sperm that you produce are haploid, right? So that it only has one set of chromosomes. But there are actually some organisms that are polyploids. Poly referring to many, so having multiple sets of chromosomes, not just one or two. And how this occurs is through non-disjunction, right? We learned about how non-disjunction is when during meiosis chromosomes don't separate from each other. We learned that Down syndrome is a result of this when a person ends up with 3 copies of the 21st chromosome rather than just 2 copies of the 21st chromosome. But non-disjunction can occur in such a way that none of the chromosomes separate. And what you can then end up with is something like a tetraploid. So tetra refers to 4, and so a tetraploid is a organism that has 4 copies of its chromosomes. And so the thing about so one kind of general characteristic of life is that you can only really produce offspring with other individuals that have the same number of chromosomes as you. So a tetraploid can only produce babies with another tetraploid. And that is exactly what has gone on with this gray tree frog. So this gray tree frog descended from a gray tree frog that was a diploid, right? So there's a diploid gray tree frog, and then you have tetraploid gray tree frogs. And essentially what happened is you had, a couple of tetraploid gray tree frogs happen to occur through non-disjunction. They happen to mate with each other. and then they started producing tetraploid gray tree frogs that are now, isolated. That they have what is essentially gametic isolation from the diploid gray tree frogs. Because the diploids can only reproduce with other diploids, the tetraploids can only reproduce with other tetraploids. So non-disjunction can also lead to sympatric speciation, where you have abnormalities with the number of sets of chromosomes that can then cause those individuals with those abnormalities to only be able to reproduce with other individuals with those abnormalities. So that's how polyploidy can cause sympatric speciation. The key thing here again, though, is that sympatric speciation is occurring within one geographic area. So the thing that happened with these gray tree frogs is all in the same forest, right? It's not as if there was some sort of barrier that formed, not like part of the forest burned down and now, and there are two different populations of gray tree frogs. Okay, so now that you know a lot more about speciation, I want us to think about speciation on a larger scale, both a longer time scale and a larger geographic scale. So there's a couple important things here, right? So one important thing is that continents move around and that sea level rises and drops. And we're going to talk about how those are good mechanisms for causing allopatric speciation. So a lot of you know that where the continents are now is different from where they were in the past. So if you go back 250 million years, all of the continents were connected to each other in one big happy family called Pangea. Those continents start to split apart. And so first, North America and Europe and Asia, they split apart from South America, Africa, and Antarctica. They kept kind of spreading out over time, so that now we have, with these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different continents that have all kind of broken apart from each other, even though they used to be all connected to each other. And the effect of those continents breaking apart from each other is allopatric speciation. Because what better geographic barrier than a huge ass ocean, right? So, one time ago in the past, South America and Africa used to be connected to each other. So any land animal could walk from South America to Africa because they are one, continent. But those split apart. Now there's a big ocean there. There's the big Atlantic Ocean separating them. So now there is that geographic barrier that then has been a mechanism for allopatric speciation. So this is just showing you where the continents are moving in the mechanism for it. So plate tectonics is why the different, these different continents are moving around. Kind of the short description of what's going on there is that there are different plates. That's what we refer to as these big geographic areas. In those plates are essentially like little docks that are, think of like a dock on a bay or an ocean. And those docks are floating on top of a liquid, magma layer. And so because of that, they're free to move around, kind of like a dock is free to move around. Or think of them as like little boats, and those little boats are kind of bumping around and moving around. So that's kind of what's going on. So like us on the North American plate, we are moving this direction. So we are moving west and north. So something like maybe 500 million years in the future, we're actually going to collide with Asia. So if you plan on living that long, you better start, practicing your Chinese and your Japanese because, or I should say your Cantonese and your Mandarin and your Japanese because we're going to be colliding with them in a long time in the future. And as I was saying before, as these continents have moved around, that's been a really good mechanism for allopatric speciation because like Africa, South America, they were once connected. Now they're not. Now there's this big geographic barrier in the middle of them. And you can kind of see this with fossils. So if you look at really, really old fossils from Africa and South America, you'll find identical fossils. The reason being is that, at one point, like I was saying, South America and Africa were connected to each other. So 250 million years ago, this lizard thing, could have occurred, throughout this whole area because there wasn't a big ocean separating these two different areas. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the effect of sea level. So sea level has risen and fallen a lot over time. And so the reason why that has occurred is because of ice. So during ice ages, you have a lot of ocean water is trapped in ice sitting on top of continents. Then during warm periods, that ice melts, goes into the ocean, and raises the sea level. Probably a lot of you, are aware of the fact that now the sea level is actually going up because big, glaciers in like Canada and Antarctica, in Greenland, in Russia, those glaciers are melting and that water is going into the ocean, causing the sea level to go up. And so the sea level has gone up and down quite a lot in the past. So if you go back something like 20,000 years, the sea level was actually 100 meters lower than it is today, right? So those of you that don't remember your meter to foot conversion, a meter is about 3 feet. So we're talking about a sea level that was actually 300 feet lower than it is today. So at that time, you could just about walk to Catalina Island because the sea level was so low. You couldn't quite walk. You'd have to swim a little bit, but it would have been a much easier swim back then. However, that would have been during an ice age, so it would have been a very cold time to try to swim out to Catalina. Anyway, so the sea level has gone up and down over time. And the result of that is that you have bridges and barriers forming as the sea level goes up and down. So what you're looking at here is Southeast Asia, right? So we have we have Malaysia, we have Indonesia, we have Borneo, the Philippines, right? So this is all Southeast Asia. And if you go back in time about 20,000 years to when the sea level was 300 feet lower, a lot of Indonesia was connected to the mainland of Asia, right? So the islands of Sumatra, Java, Borneo, those islands were actually weren't islands. They were actually connected to the rest of Asia because all of this area that is now, covered by water, that was all land back then. Because that seafloor is less than 300 feet deep, right? So all of that seafloor, 2,000 years ago would have actually been dry land. So at that time, any sort of animal could have walked around this whole area because it was all connected by land. But then the sea level came up, and now Borneo is an island that is separated from Java, which is an island separated from Sumatra, which is an island separated from Bali, from Sulawesi, from the rest of the Philippines. These are all now islands. But before, there was a lot more connection between them. So when they became islands, that makes barriers. And so, as we've been saying before, for land animals, big bodies of water is a pretty important barrier that prevents them from getting around. And so that can be a geographic barrier that can then lead to allopatric speciation. Okay, so we've talked a lot about speciation and how new species are created. I want to talk just a little bit now about the opposite of that, about extinction. Right, so speciation makes new things, extinction erases them. And extinction is probably just as much of an important part of life on this planet as speciation is. Because there's been a tremendous amount of extinction, throughout the time that life has occurred on this planet. Right, so this is showing, this is a metric of how many species there were on the planet at different times, millions of years before present, right? So like this 400 means 400 million years ago in the past and 500 million years ago in the past. And so you can see there are these big spikes where there's, a huge amount of species, and then you see these huge drops, where there's a massive amount of species being lost. This one, for instance, is what is commonly known as the Great Dying. This is, between the Permian and the Triassic eras. That's what the P and the TR stand for. And at that time, something like 95% of all species on the planet bit the dust, right? So you had this massive, massive drop over something like 10 million years that caused a huge, huge die-off in the number of species on the planet. This one right here was about 65 million years ago. You probably some of you are thinking, oh, that's maybe when the dinosaurs died. If that's what you're thinking, you're right. So dinosaurs bit the dust at this particular time. That's when the dinosaurs went out of style. And so if you look at all of these massive drops in the number of species, it kind of shows us that if you look where we are now and the number of species we have on the planet now, it is a tiny fraction of all of the things that have ever occurred on this planet. Better than 99% of anything that has ever lived on this planet is now extinct. What we have on the planet now constitutes less than 1% of all the living species that have ever occurred. Right, so extinction has been a major, major mechanism affecting life on our planet. And so the things that typically cause major extinction events are things that cause major shifts in the Earth climate. So for instance, when big meteors strike, it sends up a lot of ash up into the atmosphere that has a big effect on the climate of the planet, and in general has a cooling effect on the planet. Volcanoes can do the same thing. This has even occurred, in recent history. In the early 1800s, there was a big volcano that erupted in Indonesia, and it caused much cooler temperatures throughout the Earth for the following 2 years. In parts of North America, there was snow in North America right through the summertime when there normally wouldn't be. Big ice ages, that of course has an effect on speciation and extinction. Probably a lot of you know that, probably a lot of you remember that dinosaurs, the most likely thing that killed them off was a huge meteor. So like here's poor Arthur thinking that he's wishing, thinking that he's making a wish because of a shooting star. Little does he know, he's dead. Okay, so we tend to think of extinction as being a really, really bad thing. And in general, yes, I would say that the rapid extinction that's occurring right now because of us humans, that is not a good thing. But in general, extinction on the planet has not, necessarily been a terrible thing. So for instance, that for a large part is why we even exist in the first place. And by we, I mean mammals and primates. Right, so for a long time, mammals were very, very minimal. There wasn't a lot of mammals on the planet. Us mammals, we first appear somewhere around 170 million years ago in the past. But from 170 million years ago until about 65 million years ago, there wasn't a lot of us around. And the reason is because there was a ton of these big reptilians and big dinosaurs that were roaming the planet. And the things about dinosaurs is that they're jerks and they don't want us mammals hanging around. But lucky for us, a big meteor struck and killed off the dinosaurs, which then allowed us mammals to then start to increase in our numbers, right? So a lot more species of mammals suddenly were able to evolve after the dinosaurs bit the dust. So in fact, that extinction event was actually really good for us mammals because we would have never evolved if it wasn't for that extinction event. But be careful what you wish for. You don't want to wish for too many meteors because another big meteor could hit and then kill off all us mammals, and then something else could come along and take our place. So a meteor killed off the dinosaurs. Who knows? Maybe a meteor will kill us off too. Okay, let's talk about some other large-scale macroevolutionary type processes. So I want to talk a little bit about homeotic genes. So homeotic genes are stretches of DNA that control major developmental patterns, right? They control, for instance, the development of eyes or the development of limbs or having like a head to tail sort of symmetry, right? So they control those things. So they are really, really important genes. Something they might control, for instance, is the rate of development of limbs or parts of a body. So for instance, if you look at the arms of different mammals, you can see that the bones inside of our arms are shaped in very, very different ways. And so how that has evolved over time is that, say, the homeotic gene that controls the rate of development of the radius of a whale, uh, that gene has evolved such that now it makes that feature develop more slowly, so it ends up being shorter. Whereas the homeotic genes that are controlling the rate of development of the digits of whales and bats is making those parts develop much more rapidly, which results in them being much longer and much bigger than they were in the past. So homeotic genes in changes to them can cause major evolutionary changes, like elongation of limbs or shortening of limbs over time. Okay, another mechanism that can cause major macroevolutionary changes is what's known as pedomorphosis. So first of all, think about who goes to see a pediatrician, right? So that is children, so young individuals. And morphosis means to change, so we're talking about change of juveniles. And so what this actually refers to is when characteristics that are normally only found in juveniles and lost in adulthood are then not lost in adults. They kind of remain in adults. So the adults are evolving a more juvenile-like morphology or behavior or physiology. A really great example of that is this crazy type of salamander that's known as an axolotl. And so you see the crazy thing about it is that it has gills, right? And we don't think of salamanders as being things that have gills because typically they don't. So what has gone on here is that the tadpoles of this salamander, those tadpoles have gills. So in general, tadpoles of amphibians, of things like salamanders and newts and frogs, those tadpoles have gills because they're essentially little fish that are swimming around in the water. But what has happened is that, or what normally happens is that tadpole, springs up legs or produces legs. It starts walking around on land and it loses its gills. So the gills essentially go away as they begin their terrestrial life phase where they're walking around on land. What's happened with axolotl is that the gills just didn't ever go away, right? So they have gills when they're tadpoles, and the gills stick around until when they are adults. So normally, the gills would go away, but they've just evolved such a way that the gills now stick around into adulthood. So that's what pedomorphosis describes. And it actually even applies to us. So what you see here is the skulls of chimpanzees and the skulls of us, right? So here's a chimpanzee fetus and here's a human fetus. And so you can see they're more or less round in shape, right? They're kind of spherical shaped. And you can kind of see that in this cute little baby chimp. Its head is very sphere shaped. So, but what chimps do is as they develop, their head gets more elongate. Essentially what happens is their jaw gets much bigger and they develop these big canines and it becomes kind of more elongate. What happened to us is we evolved in such a way that our head doesn't change very much. Our head stays more or less spherical shaped like infants do, like fetuses do. So we have taken on with our skulls the features of juveniles, right? So we've taken on these pedomorphic features, having this sort of round skull in a relatively small jaw. So our skulls as adults have become more like fetuses, whereas the skulls of chimps, are very, very different from the skulls of chimp fetuses. And you can kind of see that here. This is not a chimp, but it is what's known as a black macaque. I took this picture in Indonesia a few years ago. You can see this mama macaque. It has a elongate, kind of long, kind of, I don't know, oval-shaped head, whereas this cute little baby macaque, it has a round-shaped head. Okay, just two more things I want to teach you about in terms of macroevolution. One thing that I wanted to teach you about are what are known as exaptations. So that is when a structure evolves for one purpose, but gains a new purpose. A really great example of this is bird feathers. In this video, I'll post it to Canvas so you can watch it. So probably a lot of you have seen Jurassic Park, and so you will know from Jurassic Park that birds evolved from dinosaurs. In fact, kind of a crazy thing about that is that crocodiles, so present-day crocodiles and alligators, are the things that are most closely related to extinct dinosaurs. Crocodiles and alligators are actually more closely related to birds than they are to other reptiles like snakes and lizards actually. So anyway, one group of dinosaurs evolved into birds, and that group of dinosaurs that did so, they had feathers, but they didn't necessarily use their feathers for flying like birds do today. They used their feathers for other things like keeping warm and for attracting mates. And over time, those feathers then took on a new purpose. So the purpose of flying. So exaptation is something that evolves for one purpose, like feathers of dinosaurs being used for keeping warm and for attracting mates, and then gaining a new purpose in the case of birds being used for flying. Okay, the last kind of thing I wanted to talk to you about in terms of macroevolution is I want to talk about how when there are big changes over time, they occur in intermediate functional steps. So this is showing you the eyes of different types of mollusks. And we'll talk about what mollusks are later in the semester. But all you need to know for now is that they are things that oftentimes have shells, they are squishy on the inside, and they don't have a backbone like us. And so some mollusks have very simple eyes that are just basically a patch of cells that can tell if it's light or dark. In some of them, that patch of cells has formed an indent, which allows them to form a very, very rudimentary image. And some of those, then you see a fluid-filled area, kind of like a little bit like we have. That allows an even better image. In some of those, then there's a lens inside of that fluid-filled area and a cornea covering it. The lens then allows that animal to focus on different objects at different distances from it. And then finally, you see some mollusks that have a cornea, they have that fluid, they have those cells, they have a lens, and there's muscles connected to the cells which allow them to change the focus of their eye. So this eye evolved very, very slowly over time. But what occurred along the way is that each of these things function in different ways, right? So even this very rudimentary eye is useful to this limpet, just in the same way that the more complex camera type eye of a squid is useful to that squid as well. So you have these intermediate steps that could evolve over time because each of these steps are useful. Right, so we didn't just go from this all the way to this, right? This obviously just couldn't evolve overnight. It took a long time, but you have these intermediate functional steps between them. Okay, and that's all I've got to tell you about macroevolution and in chapter 14.